Today, I have the great pleasure of speaking with someone who has helped reshape the global conversation about what business is for, and whose values and approach are so much in alignment with the vision of the Quantum Leadership Podcast. Marcello Palazzi is a co-founder of B Lab Europe, a driving force behind the B Corp movement, and a co-president of B for Good Leaders, a global community of CEOs, founders, and innovators committed to building a regenerative economy. And I'm looking forward to getting into each piece of this wonderful bio and information that I want to share with all of you because it's really quite spectacular. I had the honor of having Marcello on my quantum leadership panel this past year at the Volcano Innovative Summit. And so I've got a taste of what we're going to talk about today and really excited about it. For more than 3 decades, Marcello has been at the forefront of reimagining enterprise as a force for public good. His work spans continents, sectors, and cultures, but the through line is unmistakable. He helps leaders redesign organizations so that they create value, not just for shareholders, but for society and the planet itself. Marcello's perspective is rare. He understands the mechanics of business, the psychology of leadership, and the systems level shifts required to move from sustainability to regeneration. I'm excited to explore how he sees the future of enterprise, the evolution of the B Corp movement, and what it truly means to lead for good in a world that really urgently needs it. And most importantly, how to create new leaders that follow in his footsteps. Welcome, leaders, and those of you who want to become a leader in your own life. As the world becomes more complex and the velocity of change keeps increasing, true leadership requires resilience, presence, vision, a dynamic ability to adjust and change, and the self-awareness to create healthy environments and cultures for your constituency. I'm Dr. Stephen Sideroff, and this is Quantum Leadership Podcast, where we go beyond conventional wisdom to explore the powerful principles of the quantum effect, and that to maximize leadership's ability to connect mind, body, and organizational success. Marcello, what a pleasure to have you here with me.
Well, Stephen, my pleasure. I'm delighted. Thank you for the invitation. I'm looking forward very much to a conversation with you. I've loved the conversations we've had so far, and it's a true pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's get started by telling us a little bit about your path to leadership, because really one of the primary goals of these podcasts is to get an insight into how leaders get to the positions that they are, both in terms of their drive, motivation, hard work, and mindset, and also how they handle setbacks and difficulties, because we know it's not a straight line to leadership. So how about let's get started there?
Yeah, let's get started. Actually, I started early. I was lucky. When I say early, I mean my father and I always had a wonderful relationship. My father was an engineer, son of a lawyer and a judge. He was in business. He started 2 companies. And the second company he started, I was 16, 17, maybe even younger. And I started going into his office sometimes, during holidays and maybe when the secretaries and the assistants were not there. And I started to do things, look around and look at the files and understand how this was a chemicals company at the time. I'm saying this, maybe it's one of the first time that someone asked me such a question going back in time. But so that was one moment. And then going with him, I went to the US with him when I was 14 or 15. He was working a lot with the US and other countries. And always very enchanted by his work. And so I learned from him. soon after, so this is when I was 16, 17, 18. Then, we were living between Italy and the UK. My father put me on a company that we started together when I was 18. I think I became a director at 18. And, then we started working together because I was studying, so I wasn't doing it full time then. And the second moment was when I was at university. Through a friend of mine, I was actually invited to join the student government. And then he pushed me, and I actually got elected as president of the student government. And I think I was 21. I was 21 at the time. And I inherited a team of 6 people. And I must say, with hindsight, we did a lot of wonderful work. We were not only running the student government, which means, the sports facilities and the bars and the events and things the students would do, but we also had a seat on the board of the university. So I was representing the students on the board of the university, and I met wonderful professors and people, obviously, who were, 2 or 3 times my age. And it was very, very instructive. And I discovered that, I'm not necessarily, a complete extrovert. A pretty extrovert, but I'm not a Bill Clinton, who charms everybody necessarily. But I realized that actually there was something in me that made me appreciate and value that leadership. So it was a very interesting experience. It was like a year and a half as president of the student government. And then when I finished my degree, my first degree, I then started working full-time in the company I started with my father. My father was then mostly traveling or in Milan, and I was in London. So I basically had to run the company on my own, which I did for 14 years, which by then we had converted into an environmental diagnostics company, producing laboratories for soil and water testing to determine the quality of water and to reduce the amount of fertilizers used in the soil. So it was one of the first companies in that field. And, I had to hire people. I quite quickly, I had a team of 6 people working with me in London. And this was 1981, 82, 83. Then we got, inflation rate got to like 15% in the UK. Interest rate got to 19%. So it was not so easy. And then, I had to fire a couple of people. I had to sort of start again. Or, it was always a little bit bumpy in the first years. So those were early experiences. So to answer your question, I started early. And I often say to my kids, start early, even if it's a small thing. Start taking responsibility and leadership as early as you can.
You took on a director role, a leadership role very early, and it sounds like a big part of that was the confidence your father had in you, the direction your father gave to you. What would you say about what you got from your father in terms of leading that maybe can translate to other people who don't have that luxury of a father who takes you under his wing?
It was, first of all, wonderful experience. And then I come to something else later, which is connected. Wonderful experience, working with him for 15, 16 years. My father was a super ethical guy, even more ethical than I am, I'm meaning to say, he was super ethical, as a son of a lawyer, who wanted to stick to the law, but also the spirit of the law. So I learned a lot from him in the way that he would handle people, and he will handle transactions and contracts, and that kind of ethos was very, very important. And partly it came to him because of his education and his father and so forth. His father and mother. His mother was also a very special woman. So it was something that I kind of absorbed through my education. But I added things too. So when I was then doing my second degree, I did a master's part-time whilst I was working. I started to look at family businesses, ethics in business, beyond our company. I was in London, so Unilever and Cadbury and companies that stood out in the UK for being particularly ethical and social. And that became my path, beyond the company, this finding that integration between, say, building a successful economy or successful business and staying with your values, with your ethics. That became my journey even after my company.
So I guess for people who are not fortunate to be born into a family with such esteemed parents, grandparents, maybe the path would be to look for, identify potential mentors, people that would serve in that kind of role to give guidance, to give some support.
Subsequently, when I later, after, in 93, 94, we sold the company. I started a small foundation, and then I started my work around mobilizing other leaders. And quite quickly, I realized that, indeed, as you say, finding a mentor and peers. And ultimately, it's really about the culture of the organization you work with or you work for. And that is something that I find still today a bit more, of course, but 20, 30 years ago, people didn't really look at organizational culture the way they do now. And the way that I did, I when later, so in 1987, 89, I did my MBA at London Business School. And this was the executive program, so part-time. I was the only entrepreneur in my class, and everyone else was going into finance or into banking, consulting or finance. And I never could visualize myself, going to work for a PricewaterhouseCoopers or a Citibank in those days, everyone wearing a gray suit and thinking the same. It was for me too incomprehensible that people would do that. So the point is, people would not necessarily say, "Well, I want to work for a company with a particular culture," but they were going to work for a company that had a name, a reputation, and obviously made profits and money. So that was very interesting. I was, and I still very different today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so your goals and your interest right from the start was about more than just fitting into the existing structure of an organization, but wanting to base it on some of your own values and goals.
Yeah, well, so I was very lucky also at London Business School. I had a wonderful professor, Charles Handy. Charles Handy, has been very well known for his work in organizational leadership and organizational theory. And I really clicked with him. We became friends. And afterwards, we did quite a few things together. And Charles was a sort of philosopher, leader. He worked with Shell. And then he went to London Business School as a professor, was one of the founders. And so I think that your earlier question, which I think has stayed with me all my life, is I always also say to my children and to my colleagues, always look for people who inspire you and in a way create a relationship, get to know them. So I did that, with professors like Charles Handy, later with other people. And, throughout my career, it's always been finding these, I call them angels, the angels of your journey who, some protect you and some inspire you, but very, very important. So finding these individuals, because at the end of the day, everything always boils down between you and someone else, It's the kind of relationship you have with your wife or with your boss or with your colleagues. So it's really very personalistic.
Yes, and relationship on many different levels is so important. And the relationships you establish within a company are also so important in terms of the functioning of the organization.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And then later, quite well, actually, 1993, when I co-founded a Social Venture Network Europe, which is a sister of Social Venture Network in the US, which was started by Ben Cohen of Ben and Jerry and people like him. And it was Ben Cohen who often said, "You got to find a company that matches your values, and if necessary, you leave and you go somewhere else." I think that. It's really hard to work in an organization that has a different culture where your values don't match, and finding one sometimes can be easy, but sometimes it takes years. I know people who have taken years before they could find a matching, in terms of values and ethics. So it is quite a task, and I would say most of the time you're not being taught or helped to do that.
Right. And Most people, however, would just settle for where they're located and struggle within an organization that may not fit for them. And you're talking about a real important quality of great leaders, which is to not settle for that and to maybe even leave lucrative jobs and take a risk because the culture and the type of organization is important to them.
Yeah, I mean, completely. That brings up another issue which you relate to now, which is I think that we have in general. I mean, I remain an entrepreneur. I love entrepreneurs. I think that they are the world superpower. But in general, the business class has, in the last 30, 40 years, sort of corrupted itself, with money and prestige and status. And to some extent, in countries like the US, it is extraordinary that people can earn, I don't know, 100 million, 200 million as a CEO, It's completely way out of any sensible perspective on the world and the economy. So we have allowed ourselves to be there's a sort of corruption, and so in my life, of course, definitely since I started my small foundation, I haven't had a big salary, but that's not what drives me. So you can say, wow, Marcello, you made a sacrifice. Well, once you have enough to live on, that's kind of course, my perspective. You don't need to have a third house and a fourth house and 5 cars and private plane, So you have to choose. You have to make a choice. For me, the choice, which is not just my choice, but my studies brought me to Greek philosophy, Aristotle, and the concept of eudaimonia and well-being. So, of course, we can discuss it in some depth. That the priorities that I and other people like me see, and the perspective is that economy and business are a tool for other purposes. That the purposes are, more existential. Creating a good society, pursuing, goodness, beauty, and truth, higher values. And then it's great to have a successful economy, successful business. By all means, fantastic. But they have to serve a wider purpose.
Right, right. One of the things that I find, whether it's about us as individuals or organizations, is that we get into patterns, and patterns are hard, just like habits are hard to break out of. And so people are following the guy in front of them who's trying to make more money, who's trying to get a bigger house, bigger car, however you want to gauge success. And you're talking about taking a different path than that and breaking away from the existing pattern, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could say that. I mean, obviously, I'm by no means the only one. There are many more people like me. It's the times we live in have created a kind of a coexistence, sometimes peaceful, sometimes not so peaceful, between these different systems. I mean, I have lived in a world. That's where I started my interest in ethical business, with a lot of ethical business leaders who, again, see business as an amazing vehicle, amazing force to create solutions, to do things that are good for society. And there's many of us, but in general, we got kind of confused and kind of corrupted by this notion of profit maximization and self-interest above other interest, and a very sort of I-oriented society, which has led and is leading to not only tension between different parts of society. So, as you know, and also you can argue whether it generated this, right-wing movements because of the dissatisfaction in society. But it has also led to a lot of these environmental, ecological challenges that we face, because it's been driven by consumption, by overconsumption. It's been driven by a financialization of the economy that basically needs to keep growing to be able to pay back dividends and all the benefits that the financial world is been earning from the economy. So we are kind of stuck into that system. And there is a parallel system, but just say the system I live in, of a lot of people who social entrepreneurs or B Corps or others who also see business as a tool, as a means, not an end.
Right, right. And so, as you mentioned that, give us a little bit about your formation of B Corp and for good leaders, and tell us a little bit about how you made the choice to start those organizations.
So it does go back to 1993, 94, when 5 or 6 of us from mostly the Netherlands, I live in the Netherlands now, came over to Atlanta in the US to a conference of Social Venture Network. And there we were met by, Ben Cohen and people of that caliber who I think maybe even Yvonne Chouinard of Patagonia was there. People, Wayne Silby from Calvert, one of the first responsible banks, investors in the US. And it was really mind-blowing that there was a community that was, yes, business. I mean, some were a bit hippie, some were pretty normal guys and girls, but they saw that business finance could be a positive force. So when I got back from Atlanta, myself and 5 or 6 others started this Social Venture Network Europe. We organized events around Europe, and we kicked off this movement of, at the time, maybe 300, 400 of us. And then basically it's been a premier progression over the years. I then, for 5 years in a row, partnered with the UN, various UN agencies to bring these kind of progressive ethical business leaders to partner with various UN agencies. They were actually quite successful. And in between, in about 1997, 98, I got a phone call from the office of Kofi Annan, knowing, oh, wow, you're doing something amazing with the UN. We have to talk about how can we scale it. And that was a bit the beginning of the UN Global Compact, which now has 18,000 companies involved. So that was quite successful. At least, I was a young guy. I was like 35, 36 at the time. And I was inspired because I am inspired by what entrepreneurs can do. But the UN, the UN was organizing all these conferences on themes such as the social development or culture and science, and they were not inviting anyone from business. And I said, hey, how can you talk about social development without business? Or how can you talk about culture and the arts without enterprises? So that was kind of my contribution, which I think they understood. And then later, I continued with worked in Denmark. I helped to set up the Danish Copenhagen Center for Social Responsibility, started by Danish Minister Karen Jespersen. From there, we helped to create a European movement called CSR Europe, Corporate Social Responsibility Europe. This was about 2001, 2002. And it continued. And then I worked for 3 or 4 years in impact investing with a number of European families, and we created some very successful ventures, one of which is called Responsability, which is a finance company in Zurich, which started from nothing and now has, I think, disbursed nearly $15 billion in microfinance and small business loans all around the world. It was an amazingly successful venture. And I continue, and I worked a lot in leadership. I realized early on, my Dutch business partner, Paul Kloppenburg, was one of the first engineers to set up public-private partnerships in Europe. And we saw, obviously, you understand the logic, the public sector pursues the public good, the private sector is creative, has got money, and so how do you bring them together? That was the whole idea of public-private partnerships. And we soon realized that you can't really bring leaders from different sectors together if they're not aligned in their values and their perspectives. And so that led us to do some work around leadership development, which continued on and off many, many years. It continues to this day, actually. And then I was a big fan. I became a big fan of Scandinavia, ended up working in Sweden. I was on the board of a Swedish foundation for many years. And there we used to convene leaders every summer in Sweden, from the king of Sweden to the fisherman in Vietnam, all thinking and answering the question, how on earth can we live together? Because clearly, we live in a global world, but we're not living together, So how can we learn to live together? And this was some of the first attempts to think about system change and complexity and so forth. And I make it slightly shorter, but it's like 300 projects or ventures later. I was asked to start the B Corps in Europe, 2013. And together with a partner, we did that. And we started with one B Corp, and now we have, at least in Europe, 5,000 B Corps, and globally 10,400 B Corps. And there's also a separate stream, which is a legal it's a legal form called the Benefit Corporation. In the US, it's often called the PBC, Public Benefit Corporation, of which there are now over 20,000 around the world. And the B Corp is a philosophy of business very close to what we've been discussing, that business is the most powerful tool we have to create solutions and innovations for customers, for society. So that's the spirit of B Corp. It's basically our good friend, Paul Polman, former CEO of Unilever, asked in a very simple question, how is the world better because of your company? So if you can't answer that question, then you don't have the right company. So basically, that's continuing now. And then lately, 3 years ago, what I realized is that although we only have it's a lot, but it could be more, 10,000 B Corps, there were about 300,000 companies looking to explore what does it mean to become a B Corp. So we wanted to reach out to more people, and so we created For Good Leaders, which is a sort of informal cooperative of leaders who are pursuing similar objectives. And I must say, the last year has been quite challenging in terms of the world and where the world is going. But more and more people realize that the evidence is so stark that we don't want to go the way that Putin is going or Netanyahu, with violence and aggression and conflict and death. We want to actually build an economy of life that promotes life and promotes life of the planet and life of people. So I think the choice has never been starker. So in that sense, it's an opportunity now going forward in the next few years.
Well, it's an amazing story, Marcello, and I want to go back and some of the things that you moved so quickly over. I want to take them one at a time and get a little bit more detail. So the first is you go to Atlanta, you go back to Europe, where there's 6 of you, and then you skipped over and suddenly there were 300. What was the process to grow from 6 to 300?
It's a good question. Well, the process is enthusiasm. It's enthusiasm, it's energy, it's passion. So yeah, I was passionate. I got really high in seeing that it was possible. If a Ben Cohen can build a company like Ben & Jerry, Ben & Jerry is not a perfect company, but it's been a pretty good company in terms of being successful, making money, and creating social change, or at the very least, some people are more radical than others, but at least being a mouthpiece, a voice for issues that generally business does not speak about, whether it is environment or society or women or violence. So Ben & Jerry was a very activist company. So there was the passion of what I saw could be possible. And then it's finding people. So I sometimes think it's a sort of intelligence agency, going to find those people who have at least a latent propensity for combining, say, what Daniel Goleman will call emotional intelligence with other intelligences. So generally business is focused on the rational intelligence and it's lacking in emotional intelligence. But actually, if you can combine the two, you achieve what I think we achieve. So, and then practically speaking, it's networking and it's finding, 20 people in France and 30 people in Germany and then and bringing them together. So we had several meetings with 300 or 400 people. So we grew it like that. But it is very personalistic. Everyone was actually invited, so there was not an open event. I mean, you could apply, but you had to be selected on the basis of your ethics and your values.
Mm-hmm. So it was a process of identifying people who had the potential to buy into the ideas that you were trying to expand upon.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And it was, at that time, 1993, 94, it's actually similar in some ways to now. In other words, Europe, but also the whole world, had gone through the years of socialism. We still had, 89 is the fall of the Berlin Wall. But so soon after that, the wider sort of Weltanschauung, the paradigm started to change. And we didn't want to go all the way to kind of the neoliberal paradigm, which is basically, forget about society, forget about communities, just basically the sort of neoliberal mindset, the market, the free market can solve all the problems. We didn't want to go there because we knew that wasn't the solution, but it is finding a kind of middle way that, what in Europe sometimes we call the third way, which is more the Danish model, Scandinavian model, the German model of what we now call stakeholders, so that business is not just there for shareholders, but it's there for meeting the interest of society, the planet, etc. So today, we've gone, of course, very far towards this neoliberal market fundamentalist perspective. And there is now a backlash, I think maybe more in Europe, of course, more in Europe than in the US, but even Canada, and is obviously not wanting to stay in that economic paradigm. And, I'm working a lot now with Chinese leaders. The Chinese leaders also, in the last 2 or 3 years, have seen that the excesses of capitalism are also not good for Chinese society. So they are kind of, cutting down on corruption and making sure that there is no ostentatious wealth and that there is a kind of a social cohesion and a social conscience on behalf of, from business leaders towards society. So in that sense, it's a similar moment. And I think that the key is we want to preserve that creativity and ingenuity that comes from entrepreneurship. We want to do it in a way that is mindful of the planet and people. And there are many people like us, like me, and this what we're doing for good leaders is bringing these people together.
Another thing that you touched on is how you got a lot of the leaders together, and you were saying that in order to move forward, they have to be in alignment. And it sounded like you engaged in some processes that actually were designed to do that, to bring different leaders into alignment. Am I correct there? And what was that process when you mentioned the people from Vietnam and other places? You were talking about seemed like you were talking about some process to actually engage to create some alignment.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've done it in at least 2 ways. One way is this kind of the detective way, and by the way, I have also been working later in the last 4 or 5 years with the Vatican. I've been sitting on a think tank that Pope Francis started. And I learned from the Vatican that actually they have a whole process for identifying people who authentically want to serve the church. I mean, there is a real process, I'm not talking about the church. I'm talking about when you look for leaders who are ethical, there is a process, there is a mechanism. Sometimes it's peer-to-peer, sometimes it is conversations, it's deeper dialogues to understand who is really authentic and genuine about working and operating ethically in business. So that's something we did. It's now perhaps become a bit of a second nature. The second is what I did also with another partner of mine, Tom Cummings, American but lives in Europe, is actually creating leadership programs that aim to align these values and perspectives of leaders. And we've done many of those, for senior leaders, for younger leaders. They work. Identifying the right people is always essential. So if, Jim Collins says, get the right people on the bus, you got to bring the right people together. And that's that kind of magic, and if you don't have the right people, it's going to be much, much harder. So we go back to this discussion about corporate cultures, what kind of corporate culture, organizational culture are you looking for? So we learned a lot, and there's a couple of sort of, it's not a secret. One is women. Women are definitely, in general, more have a greater propensity to this kind of, say, more caring culture, just more respectful for other people, for planet. So even in many of the events that we organize for the B Corp community, there's always at least 60% women. The second kind of, observation, not a secret, is that the younger the people are, the more, the next generation is more prepared. Let's say, this is one of the themes I'm working on now, is the whole idea, the whole notion of unlearning and undoing. I think that a lot of what the world needs to do now is to unlearn what has brought us to where we are, all the poly crisis. And I think the younger people have less to unlearn because they haven't been, they haven't gone through the same experience. And so they are fresher. And many of them see that, yes, you want to have a fantastically successful companies, but you want to do that in line, in sync with the planet and with other people and so on and so forth. So even there in the B Corp community, I would say at least half the B Corps are run by people under 35. And that's wonderful.
That's great.
I love the energy. I think it is, I still often see myself as the guy who started the company when I was 21, so I resonate with that kind of energy, that kind of a passion, and find a lot of inspiration from these younger people.
Yeah. One of your accomplishments, which I think is fantastic, is you've gotten some government legislation to support what you're doing. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that, thanks for asking the question. Going back to 1994, I had then organized our second Social Venture Network Europe conference in Zurich, Switzerland. And I met a wonderful gentleman, Peter Pruzan, American, but living in Copenhagen. He went to Harvard Business School. He became a professor in Copenhagen and a businessman. And Peter introduced me to 4 or 5 amazing CEOs in Denmark. Mads Ovlesen from Novo Nordisk. He was then the chairman of Novo Nordisk. Lars Kohlin, who was then the chairman of Danfoss, another substantial Danish company. I think the CEO of Lego was also involved. And suddenly I was in Copenhagen meeting these amazing people. And I said to them, here we have a movement of up-and-coming companies that are working for social development, ethical companies. Why don't we start a conversation with one of your ministers? So we did, with the Danish Minister for Social Affairs, Karen Jespersen, and she was amazing and she loved it. And then because in 1995, the UN organized the UN Social Summit in Copenhagen, suddenly we had the UN, the Danish government, we as a community of progressive business leaders all working together. And that's how we created the Copenhagen Center for Social Responsibility, which, continued and had a big impact in Europe. So it was, again, finding the right individual. This lady, Karen Jespersen, she understood the power of business, but she was a minister of social development. So she got it, And so that's one way of getting a government involved. Later we had many such examples, and of course I mentioned Kofi Annan and the UN and the Global Compact. I think, 2 things. One, that is the power of entrepreneurship, that entrepreneurs have good ideas. You can't succeed without good ideas. And good ideas travel, and therefore if you can inspire some leaders in politics and government to see the power of these ideas, then you have a winning combination. Because the government, governments can scale. That's one of the beauties. So also the UN, and I mean, the Vatican is different, but the Vatican has 1.4 billion Catholics, so they can also scale. So basically, me as an entrepreneur, if I or people I work with have good ideas, then we want to scale. So that's just the beauty of a government or the UN, that you can scale good ideas. And even with the UN Global Compact, it went from nothing to 18,000 companies. You cannot do that easily. I mean, now with social technology, and it's easier than it was 30 years ago, of course, but still, scaling is what governments can do, and create a legitimacy that sometimes is not quite legitimate. But if you have a good government, I mean, Denmark had a good government, and other countries have good governments, then what you do with governments become legitimate in the eyes of citizens, and that's very important.
You mentioned the Vatican. I'm wondering if you engaged with the Vatican along your lines of sustainability and bringing in anything from the Vatican's influence to support your process.
Yeah, so I have one of my friends, Pedro Tarac in Buenos Aires, co-founded a B Corps in South America. And he introduced me to Father Augusto Zampini, Argentinian father whom Pope Francis had handpicked to work with him in Rome. And we had a fantastic conversation. And Augusto Zampini has 2 degrees in economics. He worked in global development, but he's a priest. And of course, there are many people like that, who are very competent in the profession, but they're still parts of the church. So anyway, Augusto and I started talking, and then we created several dialogues with CEOs and the Vatican it was focused on the encyclical that Pope Francis wrote, Laudato Si. Laudato Si was launched about 10 years ago, is a wonderful text, a bit long perhaps, but it's about praising creation, praising life, which translates quite easily into what a good business should be doing or could be doing, So we started a conversation, and then, I got invited into this think tank, the Laudato Si Action Network or Action Platform that Pope Francis started. And the relationship is ongoing. We organized 2 meetings at the Vatican in the last 2 years. And now with Pope Leo, it's a wonderful opportunity to work with him as an American, as someone who lived in Peru for 20 years, is sort of, can be he is a wonderful spokesman for a kind of ethical message, which I think the world needs. So we will continue. And of course, the church has problems. We know that, it's a systems problem, but there are many wonderful people in the church too. So it's the same as with China, we work a lot with China, and of course, China is problematic. We know it's problematic, but it's 1.4 billion Chinese. So obviously there are a lot of good Chinese. So it's finding the right people, it's always the same. For me, at least, it's also part of how do you understand history, whether you allow history to be colored by individual leaders and not just, say the ebbs and flows or the macro trends that dictate history. I think there is there's a lot of space for individual leaders to make a difference, even in over the long term.
Yeah. Well, Marcello, you're clearly a leader that's making a difference, and I'm thinking about all the people listening to our interview, our podcast, and if there are, how would you address the people listening to this in terms of getting involved, in terms of uh, beginning to share these concepts that you hold so dear? How can they get involved? How can they maybe break out of old patterns, or even begin to taste the waters of what you're talking about? I know you've talked about organizations, companies that have different greater values than just than just profit. In your work, you talk about both corporations that focus on sustainability, and then you've followed that up with regeneration. So maybe you could talk about that, but your suggestions to people listening to this podcast.
It's not easy in the sense, it's not, meaning to say, there's a lot of different things that are necessary. And I am not even 100% sure that I know all the things that have made me go the way I've gone in my life. But I could obviously share. What I share is, first of all, there is a continuity. I think it's quite easy to do the right things from time to time, but it's not so easy to do it every day, every hour. Every decision you make is consistent with your values or with your ethics. So that kind of a coherence and continuity, which obviously requires sort of introspection and being, self-analytical to really ask yourself those questions. The second is a sort of, sometimes you can compromise, but there are certain things you cannot compromise on. So distinguishing what you could compromise and what you can't compromise. And one of my friends with whom I worked a lot in Sweden, Bo Ekman, he coined the word of principle pragmatist. So it's that combination. You have to have principles, you have to stick with your principles, but you have to be pragmatic. So meaning it's pragmatic is realistic and opportunistic. Opportunistic with a small letter, So at the same time, keep your principles. So that's the second thing I would say. The third, which you pointed out earlier, is have a kind of circle of peers. It could be one person, it could be two, it could be a mentor with whom one has a deep relationship and also a frank relationship about, well, am I doing the right things? Am I making the right decisions? The big decisions in life, I'm talking about big decisions. So that can be very, very, very helpful. The fourth, which again, Paul Polman often talks about, is courage grows when you are together with others. So when you have 4, 5, 10 leaders or people around you, it's much easier to be courageous together than on your own.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So create these kind of, some people call them the islands of coherence, or I remember many years ago, ethical islands. To create a small or sometimes a large ecosystem of leaders who can actually encourage each other, support each other to do the right things. Which, by the way, was many years ago, in 93, actually, I met Muhammad Yunus, founder of the Grameen Bank, now I think is president of Bangladesh. And the whole system of microfinance essentially worked because the investor would give money to a group of women, it's mostly women, that became a kind of a peer circle where they supported each other and also kept each other in check, well, yeah, you lent money, well, you better pay the money back. And so there was a kind of a social control, and that worked very well. So having your own peer group of leaders where you can find support and encouragement and counsel is very, very important. Maybe the final thing I say is, which is not it's not an individual issue, it's a societal issue. I think we've become a sort of insatiable race. We always want more, and that clearly, in an age where we have planetary boundaries, can no longer work. And you can argue that this also I have an Indian friend, Ashok Koshla. Ashok said there is an Indian say, there is always enough for everyone's needs, but never enough for one person's greed. So basically, how do you get to a culture, a society where we know where enough is enough? And it doesn't mean being against growth or against business. No, it means distinguishing those things that valuable for the flourishing of humanity, and those things that are superfluous or unnecessary. So we could all become highly learned, highly wise, living in beautiful places. I mean, that's all fine, but it's the things that are superfluous and sometimes negative for planet and people that we should stop doing. So that's also why at the beginning I talked about undoing and unlearning. We need to do a lot of that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, those are great points that you make. And what I love about all of what you've been saying is it fits so well with this notion of quantum leadership, just self reflection, alignment, coherence. All of these are aspects of my concept of quantum leadership that really takes its lead from the basic fundamental aspects of the universe, of quantum reality. And here we are actually talking about how they can be played out on the human level. And if we follow them, it really could be the path to sustainability and regeneration that you prize so much. So I appreciate all of the things that you've been saying. And I have a question for you, with your For Good Leaders. Can you say just a little bit about that organization? And is that a place that people listening to this, uh, aspiring leaders or already leaders in their own realm, if that's something that they can get involved with?
So thanks, Stephen. By the way, because I read half your book on the 9 principles of resilience. I love your work, and I think you have a lot of wisdom and amazing experience. It's a pleasure to be here with you. For Good Leaders is a cooperative. It's basically when we built a big community. We have like 45,000 people. I mean, of course, some more engaged than others, but these are all people who either myself or some of my colleagues have know personally. So it's a highly selected group. And we are now, after 3 years, finalizing a strategy of deeper engagement, which we're going to be launching in the next couple of months. So they will have different levels of, of engagement. The basic level is you become a friend, you receive intelligence from us, and that's it. Second level is you become a citizen and you are more involved and you can connect with other leaders. And then there's a third level, the champion, where you can really activate the community, do things with other leaders in the community, et cetera, et cetera. So that will be launched on our website, forgoodleaders.com. So anyone who's interested can do that. We either nominate people, so we either select people, we invite them out, or we get nominations. Because it's very important that at least someone knows the person who would like to join. Because the quality, I mean, it's not about, it's not about being elitist, but it's about being consistent with our values and our ethics. So that's the basis. And so in general, I mean, and this goes back also to your question about sustainable regenerative. I mean, the world is really at a turning point. We cannot continue with the economy and business as usual. I would say also we need to rethink some of our politics, given that in many countries, we have real challenges of either right-wing extremist or authoritarianism. I mean, there are many countries that do not have that. But in general, even in Europe, speaking as a European, even here in Europe, whether it's the UK or even in the Netherlands to some extent, and France and Germany, there are challenges in terms of this authoritarianism and right-wing extremism. So economics and politics do need to change. And so I talk about the Great Reset, we have to reset, the values for our civilization going forward. Also, I think it's quite worrying to see that after 30, 40, 50 years of more and more globalization, we are going back. And we're going back also in terms of becoming quite racist about people, and which is partly, I think it's partly accentuated by our politicians. It's a pity that politicians take advantage of that, because I think that you live in LA. I lived many years in London. I was lucky to spend a year at Harvard, a year at Stanford. When you are in these sort of environments, you don't ask yourself the question about whether you come from or culture. In London, people live together. There's 200 nationalities. So we have succeeded as a race to create multicultural societies. And so it's a shame that we're going back on that, At the time when, whether because of migration or whether because of, very challenging situations in many countries, people are moving. Maybe people don't know in LA, but every year in the Mediterranean, I think there are like 200,000 people die trying to cross the Mediterranean, coming into Spain or Italy, these are poor people who, they're risking everything they have just to cross over, because lives in their countries are impossible, or like in Iraq and countries like that, it's really, we have to be mindful of that reality. So it's a real shame that we're going back. So anyway, because of these factors, I talk about this great reset, which is about fundamentally asking, what does it mean to be a human in 2026, going forward in the next 20, 30, 50 years? So there are a lot of big questions about the way we organize our societies, democracy and economy and finance and technology and AI and so forth. So we would like to see that even AI can be positive for the world if we govern it properly. So we are at that moment of great reset, and it will take a lot of hard work to be able to do this great reset in a way which is positive for the planet and for people.
Yeah. These are wonderful points, Marcello. From my perspective, one of our challenges is the very fact of our progress. So progress is happening really at an exponential rate right now, never before seen in the history of mankind. And to many people, it's creating tremendous uncertainty and is very scary. And when people are fearful, they tend to contract. They tend to circle the wagons. And one of the consequences is some of the political things that we're seeing now, because there's so much uncertainty with the exponential growth that's happening. And we can't stop that growth and probably don't want to stop that growth, but people like you and I need to figure out ways to help people be okay and be more resilient with this growth, so that they aren't taken by quick solutions or solutions that cut off other people from themselves and isolate. So there's a lot that needs to be done right now. And I appreciate all that you're doing along these lines to really expand this notion of sustainability, regeneration, bringing people together, bringing people into alliance and coherence. And we can keep going on and on with this conversation, but this has been really fantastic. I appreciate it. And I look forward to us doing some interesting things together as a result of our mutual interests. So, Marcello, thank you so much for this really stimulating conversation.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you, Stephen. And I'm looking forward to our next encounters and work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining me on this Quantum Leadership podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think bigger, lead more authentically, and take steps toward meaningful change. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with others and make sure you subscribe and go to my website, drstephensideroff.com. Thank you again.